Hi guys, Kenna here. Today we're going to go ahead and talk about homeostasis and feedback. Now, if you watched the movie that we showed you a little earlier going over a similar topic with the Amoeba sisters, a lot of this should seem really familiar. If not, that's okay. We did talk about homeostasis when we were going over the characteristics of life. And so this is something that we've talked about. This idea of kind of maintaining internal balance is an important part of living systems. And so we're going to look at that with respect to the feedback mechanisms that occur within living organisms and other situations to help us go ahead and regulate this internal balance. So let's go ahead and start with our essential questions. Now, first of all, what is homeostasis? You have some idea, but we want to make sure you have a really clear definition about what homeostasis is before we really talk about how it functions and the types of feedback that it can go ahead and be regulated by. Then, number two, what are the three homeostatic control mechanisms and what do they do? We'll go ahead and identify these. And if we think about Maslow's hierarchy and fulfilling your needs, a lot of these fall into these categories of your body recognizing uh, problems and then trying to react to them internally. And number three, how are positive and negative feedback different and similar to each other? Now, they're both feedback mechanisms, but hopefully you can identify how each one functions and how they work because some of the terminology here can be confusing to people. So let's start out with defining what is homeostasis. So, our definition here is homeostasis is the property of a system in which variables are regulated so that internal conditions remain stable and relatively constant. So there's your definition right there. And the things I want to go ahead and highlight for you is that it's what allows these things to remain stable and constant. Okay. It's not perfect. It's going to fluctuate a little bit within a range, but it stays in that range by and large. If it doesn't, then we start looking at our control mechanisms coming into play. Now, all living organisms depend on maintaining a complex set of interacting metabolic chemical reactions. So, when we start looking at all these different chemical reactions, it requires a lot of energy, it requires a lot of materials. They have to be maintained in certain compositions, in certain percentages. And so, it's really a fairly complex set of chemical reactions that keep a living organism functioning. So, from the simplest unicellular organisms to the most complex of plants and animals, these internal processes operate to keep the conditions within a very tight set of limits to allow the reactions to proceed. So, when we start thinking about certain temperature ranges, we start thinking about certain concentration limits. These are all playing into our bodies maintaining homeostasis. Now, the homeostatic process acts at the level of the cell, it acts at the level of the tissue, it acts at the level of the organ as well as acting at the level of the organism as a whole. So there are many different levels of homeostasis within just one single organism. The cell you want to keep stable, the tissue wants to keep stable, the organ wants to keep stable, as well as the organism overall. Now, how does it do that? Sometimes you're going to have events in the environment around you or even in the internal environment which cause the organism to move away from this stable homeostasis. Okay? So you can think about homeostasis like the process by which we maintain equilibrium, if that helps. So, how do we maintain equilibrium in this process of homeostasis? Well, the way this is primarily done is through control mechanisms. And most control mechanisms they will identify in terms of three parts. Now, those three parts are, let me clear my drawings, the receptor, the control center, and the effector. All right. So they all rely upon each other to function properly. But essentially, what happens is there's some change in the conditions that are considered normal or regular for that particular system. So let's say, for example, we use temperature in this instance. You have a stimulus or some change that occurs. In this case, we're going to look at a rise in body temperature. your body notices this because of the receptor. So in this case, your skin and brain are going to sense the change in your body. That then is going to send a signal from the skin to the brain to go ahead and say, hey, we've got an issue. Let's go ahead and make a change. In this case, the brain is then what's called the control center. And that control center is going to send a signal back out, this time to the effector, or the thing that's going to cause the response. So in this case, we're sending a signal back to the skin and to the sweat glands in particular, and to the blood vessels. So the skin begins to sweat and the blood vessels begin to dilate. These are ways that your body is going to go ahead and lower the overall body temperature. This is a good example of what we call negative feedback. And we'll talk more about this a little later in today's notes. But you can see that there's a stimulus that causes a change in the environmental conditions. Your body recognizes that process with the receptor. The receptor sends a signal to the control center, often your brain, but not always. And then the control center is going to send out a responding message to the effector, who's going to do something to try and fix the situation. So there are lots of different control systems, and we could give you numerous examples. But just remember that it's the receptor that does the actual, okay? So it's the receptor that does the sensing of the issue. Okay. And that it sends off the signal to go ahead and do something about this. The stimulus is the thing that the receptor recognizes. And then once that stimulus has been recognized, the receptor sends that signal off to the control center. And the control center is what's going to go ahead and send a message out to the part of the body that can do something about it. And that part of the body is going to be what we call the effector. So we start out with the stimulus that is detected by the receptor. That receptor is going to send a message to the control center, which is then going to go ahead and send another message out to the effector to go ahead and try and correct whatever the deviation was, putting you back into the normal range. Okay. So when we go ahead and look at this, let's see if we can give you some examples of negative feedback within this type of control mechanism. Okay. So negative feedback, as much as that may sound like it's a bad thing or it's going down, doesn't necessarily work that way. Negative feedback simply means that it's reversing the direction of the change. And so one of the things I really like to start identifying when we start doing this is, let's say I set up a normal range. Okay. So these two lines represent, let's change the color before we start typing here, the normal range. And your body is going to have some sort of response that takes it out of that normal range, either going up, a rise in body temperature, say, or going down, a decrease in body temperature. Now, your body's going to recognize this, and it's going to do so at the receptor level. Okay, whatever the stimulus is that caused it, the receptor is going to go ahead and identify it. So then your body's going to send that message from the receptor to the control center. And the control center then is going to go ahead and send a message back out to the effector. And the effector is going to do something about it. Now, in negative feedback, we're going to see that change get reversed. Okay, now this one makes some sense. This is negative feedback because it's reversing direction, going back to the normal range. But on this side, if we had a lower body temperature, negative feedback is going to actually go up. This is still negative feedback because it's reversing the direction that the change was happening. Okay, so negative feedback is going to reverse. Let's make it a little bigger. Reverse the direction of change. Okay. So again, either going up if it was going down, or go down if it was going up. It reverses whatever the trend was that was happening. And let's do an example. So let's talk about regulating blood pressure. Blood pressure. Hopefully all of you know what blood pressure is. So inside your body, your heart's beating, and that's going to put some pressure on the walls of your blood vessels. Now, your blood vessels can sense resistance of the blood flow against the walls when the blood pressure increases. So the blood vessel acts as the receptor in this case, and they will relay this message to the brain. The brain then is going to send a message to the heart and blood vessels, both of which are going to act as effectors. The heart rate would decrease, so we're going to slow down the beating of the heart, and the blood vessels are actually going to increase in diameter, known as vasodilation. So bigger blood vessels and slower pumping is going to decrease the overall pumping, the overall pressure on the inside walls of the blood vessels. This causes the blood pressure to drop, fall back into normal range, and this is a great example of negative feedback response. Okay, so blood pressure went up, 1. Okay, that's recognized by the blood vessels. So the blood vessels are going to go ahead and be the receptors. So let's go ahead and identify that. Okay, so the blood vessels are going to end up being the receptors right there. That's going to then send a signal to the brain. Okay, so here's number 2. Here's the control center, which is going to go ahead and send out a message back to the effectors. So then we'll go ahead and go over here. And we've got 2 of them in this case. We've got the blood vessels as one, and then we've got our heart as the other one, both of which are going to be effectors, and that causes negative feedback, which again is where we reverse the direction of change as the change going up gets reversed back into normal range, or the change going down reverses back into normal range. So negative means to reverse the direction of change. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense when we go ahead and do that. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and move on and start looking at this whole loop again. I'll give you another example when we go ahead and take a look at, say, body heating up and sweat. Okay, that's one that we've talked about so far. All right, so let's clear our drawings and go ahead and move on. So once again, here are our parts: stimulus, sensor, control, effector. The terms that we went ahead and used were, instead of sensor, receptor. Okay, and I'll just go ahead and add center here. So this is the control center, and that's the receptor. Now, let's say your body temperature exceeds 37 degrees Celsius. That's pretty high, okay? So when your body temperature spikes a fever, your nerve cells in the skin and the brain send a message as the receptor to the brain, or to at least the regulatory area. The temperature regulatory center is the brain, and it says, whoa, too hot, we need to do something to fix this. And so what it does is it sends a message out to the sweat glands throughout the body to go ahead and release the water, which helps to evaporate and lower the overall body temperature. So that, therefore, is the effector. All right, so now let's go ahead and start looking at an example of positive feedback. Now, I have to tell you right off the bat that there are far fewer examples of positive feedback than there are negative feedback in most living systems. Usually, we want to stay in the normal range, and when we do so, it's going to require negative feedback to go ahead and bring us back in. So let's start out with our range again. Okay, we'll go ahead and label it. Let's go a smaller font. This is going to be our normal range. All right. So when we have normal range, we have the same issue we had before. Okay, something occurs in the environment, some sort of stimulus that's going to send us outside of the normal range, whether that's going up or whether that's going down. Now, when you go ahead and take a look at these types of changes, if you remember, I'll go ahead and bring in our examples from before. We had negative feedback that reversed that and brought it back into normal range. We had negative feedback which reversed that. So these are both examples of negative feedback. But if we're going to go ahead and deal with positive feedback, what happens? So after you have that initial change in the environment, positive feedback is going to escalate it. Positive feedback is going to cause it to continue on outside of the normal range. And so you can see why this is not as common in most living systems. So that's positive feedback. That's positive feedback. So the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about this is when we start thinking about things like stampede mentality. All right. I don't know how much you guys know about, say, horses, but horses tend to be fairly skittish. They go ahead and they get scared really easily. Let's say a plastic bag goes ahead and blows in to their pen, and one horse sees it, and then that horse starts bolting and starts running across the field. Now, often the other horses in there, even though they have no idea what's going on, will see the horse running, get scared, and start running. And that increases the number of horses or cattle in the example of the picture running. And so you have more and more and more of them running, not really knowing what they're running for, but kind of sharing this sense of being afraid. Okay. So that's an important kind of thing to keep in mind when we go ahead and take a look at this. In living systems, as I mentioned, this is not super common. But one example where this does happen is in pregnancy. So if you think about a woman's typical monthly cycle, we start dealing with this concept of, you know, every month the hormones go ahead and begin to peak. As they go and get to a point, if the woman doesn't get pregnant, those hormones fall back in within normal limits. Okay. The idea is that she's getting ready in case she gets pregnant. However, if she does get pregnant, we amplify or ramp up the process of sending more and more and more hormones to get her body ready to go ahead and carry the baby. So pregnancy during, those early stages is a good example of a positive feedback system where you see a rise in the level of hormones, you get to a point, we check, are we pregnant? Are we not pregnant? But if you are pregnant, then those hormones just keep going up to go ahead and cause the physiological changes that are important to go ahead and prepare for the pregnancy. So this is not typically as common, but what we typically look at when we go ahead and look at this is amplified. Okay. So in this case, instead of being reversed, what we're going ahead and looking at is in these instances, we're looking at amplifying change. All right. So what happened when we left the normal range gets amplified even further away from what is considered to be the normal range. Okay. So as we go ahead and move on, we have to realize, what does this mean when we are outside of normal range? Well, typically when we think about homeostatic imbalances, this is really a sign of illness. Okay. This is a sign that the body is not in its normal place. It's not happy, and it's going to try and get itself back into some sort of sense of balance or equilibrium. Certain homeostatic imbalances, you think about things like internal body temperature or excessive salt or low blood oxygen, can actually create emotions inside your body. If you feel warm, if you feel thirsty, if you feel breathless, these are good examples of your body creating an emotion that reflects its need or want for something. Okay. And your body hopefully encourages you to go ahead and change your behavior to go ahead and correct the imbalance. The only problem is that as an organism ages, the efficiency of these control systems becomes reduced. The inefficiencies gradually result in more and more unstable internal environments, and that increases your risk of illness, and typically will lead to physical changes that are associated with aging. Many of our diseases actually involve some sort of disturbance in homeostasis. So, as we begin to start talking about overall health and homeostatic balance as opposed to imbalance, I want to talk a little bit about what are the factors going on in your life, especially when we start thinking about, your life and all the things you're dealing with right now. It's not typical school. You're doing this online. When you go ahead and start thinking about how healthy you are, we have to think about a lot of different factors. So let's take a look at what's called a wellness wheel. And I would typically go ahead and print out a copy of this and make it available to all of you. There are 5 areas that we typically identify as being important to your overall wellness. The better you do at all of these, it's going to help protect you if you don't do as well at some of the others. Now, when I go ahead and look at this particular wellness wheel, there are 3 of them that you have a lot of control over. One of them you have some control over, and one of them really you have almost no control over. So pause this for a minute, take a look at the wellness wheel, and think about what 3 areas you have the most control over, which one you have the least control over. Okay, welcome back. So, what did you come up with? Well, hopefully, the 3 that you identified as ones that you probably have some sense of control over are going to be diet, exercise, and sleep. Okay. The others you have less control over, and the one that has probably the least control that you have is the health of your overall system. When you start looking at your system, this is largely based on your genetics. And so this is inherited from your parents and not really something you have a whole lot of control over. Okay. But these are the 3 I want to go ahead and focus a little bit on today, because the stress, there are going to be things that happen in your life that cause stress. You think about COVID, you think about the forest fires, you think about the political and civil unrest that's going on right now in our country. There's not a whole lot you can directly do about that. You can find ways to help manage the stress in your life, right? But you can't really go ahead and remove the stresses completely. So we need to go ahead and focus on those 3 aspects that we should or do have some control over. Now, diet. What are we thinking about? We talked about when we were looking at our macromolecules, the fact that you are what you eat. So it becomes really important to maintain a well balanced diet and eat foods and consume materials that are going to help you to build a strong and healthy body. Eating a whole bunch of sugars and fats is not going to do that. You need a little bit of fat, but you need a whole bunch of really healthy materials. Lots of things that have natural sugars, like when you start talking about fruits and vegetables. Okay. The botanist in me doesn't love that term vegetables, but you can ask me about that another time. So we can control our diet. Okay. Typically, smaller meals spread out is better. That doesn't always work with our schedule. But what do you eat and how often do you eat? Okay. Then we go ahead and take a look at exercise. Hopefully, you are getting some exercise daily. It's harder. I know I struggle more with it, with being on this distance learning modality, but you should be getting hopefully an hour of exercise a day. Okay, and now I know that seems like a lot, but this can be broken up into pieces, and walking counts. But the higher the impact of it in terms of your cardiovascular, probably the better for you overall. Do you run? Do you play basketball? What is it that kind of gets you up and out of your chair and moving around? And then the last one, which I think a lot of you are not necessarily the best on, is your sleep. Okay. Someone of your age typically should be having about 8 hours of sleep a night, plus or minus 2 hours because of whatever your personal internal clock. But you really shouldn't be going below that. And I know a lot of us do frequently. As you age, you tend to need less sleep, but how much depends again and varies a little on the person. But you should really be trying to target somewhere around that number. Okay. So I can go ahead and post in Classroom the wellness wheel just as a PDF. If you're interested, you can print it out, just kind of help remind yourself. But if you're getting less than you need on any one of these particular categories, you'll notice in the middle is inflammation. This is essentially ill health. as you decrease your body's safeguards from having a healthy diet, good exercise levels, good amounts of sleep, as you lower the quality of any of these five areas, you start to be at higher risk of getting sick. Okay, and that's the reality of all of this, is that we want to protect ourselves as much as we can to stay in homeostatic balance. Okay. All right. So I hope that makes some sense. Let's go ahead and take a look at what happens if you don't maintain these. All disorders are characterized by some sort of disturbance to your homeostatic regulation. For humans, this typically occurs within your tissues of your body somewhere, whether this is cancer or some sort of arthritis or diabetes. The body is not maintaining normal range of behavior. Okay. And so imprecise functional mechanisms often include things with the receptors, the control centers, and the effectors. In fact, many diseases, especially genetically inherited diseases, are caused by a malfunction of one of these three pieces of our regulation system. So let's say a receptor fails to respond adequately. So something bad happens, but it doesn't signal the brain to do anything to fix it. Okay, that's a problem. You're likely to get sick. Or let's say the receptor works and it sends that message, but then the control center doesn't receive the information correctly, or it doesn't send out the correct response to the effectors. The body doesn't do the correct thing, it doesn't repair the imbalance, and the organism gets sick. Or in the third case, the effector doesn't work. So the receptor sends the message to the control center. The control center gets the message correctly, sends out the correct response, and then the effector gets that response message and goes, and doesn't work properly. Okay? Organism gets sick. So when we start looking at this is what we're really talking about. Ill health, disease, these things are caused by disturbances in normal homeostatic regulation. So, what's the difference then between homeostasis, say, and metabolism? Well, metabolism is the amount of energy the body extracts, stores, and uses to maintain itself. So, it's related, especially when we start thinking about diet, that was one of the arms of that wellness wheel. But it's only one piece of the homeostatic regulation. So, the relationship between homeostasis and metabolism is such that homeostasis is required for metabolism to work efficiently. Effective metabolism is one of the body's ways to maintain homeostasis. But this isn't just at the organismal level like you think of. This applies to many different systems that try and maintain this sort of internal balance. Have any of you heard of Gaia? Okay. So if you have, awesome. Uh, but Gaia is from mythology. Gaia is one of the titans that represents Mother Earth. But there is what's known as the Gaia principle, the Gaia hypothesis, or the Gaia theory, which views our planet as one giant superorganism. And so homeostasis has been easily observed within our biosphere and ecosystems. The environment seeks stability through the process of photosynthesis respiration, through the water cycle, through predator prey relationships. There are numerous examples. But if one of those gets out of balance, it's like your car engine. If something happens and a problem happens in one piece of it, you may or may not notice right away, but when you need that piece, all of a sudden now there are all these problems and it throws everything out of whack. Okay. Now, instead of being able to produce a negative feedback response that corrects the problem, if it's a big enough problem, it may cause an amplification and send into a positive feedback response, which may destroy the systems as we currently know them. Okay. At the planetary level, we actually see this in both directions. Okay, positive feedback mechanisms occur as cooling happens on our planet. Ice begins to grow, that increases the albedo. And as the albedo, well, an albedo, if you don't know, is how much of the heat light that we reflect back into outer space. But if we increase that, we're getting less heat. Our planet continues to cool down, and the process just keeps spiraling. On the other end of this, we can think about things like global climate change and looking at heating patterns. As the planet's temperature gets hotter, the ice begins to melt. This decreases the albedo, which means we absorb more heat from the sun, which causes our overall planet temperature to continue to increase. Now, on the other end of that, we also have these negative feedback mechanisms. Whereas the planet warms, it increases weathering, erosion, things like this, which weakens the greenhouse effect, which causes cooling on our planet. So, as long as we're not too far out of the homeostatic range, the planet is actually able to correct itself. But if we get too far out, the negative feedback mechanisms begin to stop working effectively, and the positive feedback mechanisms begin to take control. Likewise, if the planet gets cooling, you have less weathering. Less weathering causes a stronger greenhouse effect, which causes a warming of the overall planet. So, what do we need to kind of keep in mind moving forward as we start talking about transport in cells? We start looking at energy within cells. Organisms are going to exchange matter and energy with the environment in order to grow, maintain themselves, and to reproduce. These are those characteristics of life that we've been talking about since the beginning of the semester. Organisms have various strategies in order to capture and store these energy for use in these biological processes. We need them. We saw that when we were looking at our wellness wheel in order to go ahead and continue to maintain this balanced internal state, okay, in order for homeostasis to work. At the cellular level, cellular homeostasis requires a maintenance of internal environment that differs from the external environment, which can be hard. Okay. We think about the plasma membrane as being one of the key ways that a cell helps to keep itself separated from the external environment, getting in what it needs and getting out what it doesn't want anymore. And so that's what we're going to focus on in the next coming classes. All right. So that's what I've got for you today, guys. I hope you enjoyed our presentation on homeostasis and feedback mechanisms. And I look forward to talking to you guys soon. Take care. Bye.